and what our options are. I'd also like to introduce our special counsel, Rebecca Lee, who is an observer primarily tonight, who has been hired by the City Council and the Planning Board to advise us on details if and when we get to the point of negotiating a development agreement, and potentially if there are some zoning issues that need very specifically to be addressed in the context of a potential development in the Waterfront West Zone. I might say that, well, I suppose she can introduce herself, but she has extensive experience in the Boston area in real estate law and becomes highly recommended by her peers. With that in mind, Andy, you're up.
Thank you.
One more thing. Yes. There was some concern about the possibility of doing this in executive session, which I thought early on might have been advisable, but we're not going to get to that tonight. We won't be as specific as we might be at a future date in terms of crafting elements of a development agreement, which is a contract, which is subject to executive meeting rules. So if there are people here who are concerned about us going into executive session, it's not our intention tonight to throw you out and talk in private. Okay? Andrew?
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy Ford. I'm the Director of Planning and Development. My office is responsible, among other things, for helping with the city to plan for long-term needs, the long-range planning of the city. So there's lots of other functions we serve, but one of them is to consider long-term needs, looking at prior planning studies, developing new plans for the future. These are global documents for the city. So I'm going to be going over some of the items for the chair and the president of the council after we go over some background here. So some of the context for Waterfront West arises from these particular documents or dates. So I'll be going over briefly, as best I can, some of the salient points of the Waterfront Strategic Plan from 2003. So obviously, the council president pointed out some years have passed since prior planning studies have been done. So the city does need to consider, just like the zoning ordinance of the city, what needs to be modified periodically for changing needs of the community. The 2004 Waterfront West Overlay District, which is a zoning overlay of that area, I'll give some more background on each of these. But that was adopted shortly after the Waterfront Strategic Plan to implement some of the recommendations of that Waterfront Strategic Plan. Briefly, an overview of the 2017 New England Development Proposal and then its revised version in 2018 this year. There's a lengthy set of presentations and material that's on the city's website, so I'm not attempting to summarize all of that material here. It would be too much, I think, for one evening. And also to go over briefly some of the 2018 subcommittee evaluation criteria. That's a committee that was established between the planning board, subcommittee of the planning board, and the city council planning and development committee. So these are representatives from both the city council and the planning board. It was set up to review the Waterfront West proposal by New England Development. So there are some specific criteria that were established for review of that proposal, which I think is a good outline. And then at the end, I think I'll just speaking as director, I'll identify a couple of key areas I think for consideration by the council and all of us as we look at the Waterfront West project. I hope that the goal out of both tonight and future meetings is to come to some sort of consensus over what the city wants in these major issues, irrespective of what the development is proposing, so we can then evaluate that and find out if we move forward or not. Waterfront West, this is just a quick map of the downtown. That's the Waterfront West area right here next to Route 1. I think most of you, if you're here this evening, you probably know where it is. Again, this is just a photograph of the waterfront looking south. There's the Waterfront West area. When I say Waterfront West, I'm referring in this outline here to the Waterfront West Overlay District. So that's the boundaries of the area that are established in our zoning map for Waterfront West. New England Development, when they came in 2017, and again this year, when it was revisited, proposed to focus on an area that's a subset of that you see right there. So a slightly smaller area, but still part of the Waterfront West Overlay District. The 2003 Waterfront Strategic Plan, this is the study area, so it goes all the way from the Yankee Landing Marina to Java Park. There's a couple of different landmarks there, just to give you an idea of where you are oriented. But that, in the aerial photograph, there's an area along the water's edge. That study area was used, those are the boundaries of the 2003 study. And there's the Waterfront West area within that, and that was also focused on as a subcategory of that study. So I just tried to pull some salient points, I think, from each of these plans and documents, and I thought this was a key element for us to emphasize here, that in Waterfront West, we have an opportunity to extend the streets and the character of historic Newburyport to the waterfront. That area had buildings previously. It's obviously been used as a boatyard for some time. But the city, this is not something new where the city is hearing a proposal from New England Development for buildings to be in that area. That was historically the state, and it's also been contemplated by the city in prior planning studies that there would be buildings or some sort of development happening there. This isn't coming just from New England Development. Newburyport no longer has the buildings extending to the water, but there were extending along those wharves, federal-style buildings. And we have an opportunity to connect the downtown itself, essentially from Merrimack Street out to the river, with public ways, streets, bike trail, and architecture and a vibrancy of uses that are compatible, so to speak, with the downtown.
And can I interrupt you for a moment? And this is an error on my part. If you spoke at the microphone or brought the microphone to you, people who are watching on TV might also hear your presentation.
Good boy. Thank you. It's all right. I'm actually going to...
Yeah, do your Frank Sinatra thing.
Can you hear me?
Can you
Does that work?
stand away because it's blocking? Can you move the stand?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
So hopefully folks can hear me with this. I apologize. And I also apologize for the councilors, the printouts being mixed up in terms of the forwards and backwards. The 2003 Waterfront Strategic Plan, it was prepared by the city itself, not a consultant. Again, we always go back to what is the city's measure of what it wants for Waterfront West, when evaluating other new development or any other proposal. We go back to our planning documents, public policy established by the city council, the mayor, planning board, et cetera. It was developed by consultants with assistance from my office. Prior to my tenure here, it was adopted by the city as a policy guidance for the city. It's a vision for the future of the waterfront, including the Waterfront West area. And it ultimately resulted in the next year in the adoption of the Waterfront West Overlay District, which implemented some of the recommendations of that plan. It had 4 primary goals: to support the working waterfront and enhance the facilities, to extend the historic waterfront with a new mixed-use neighborhood, to improve the public access to the waterfront. We can all sort of walk through the boatyards there, but I just wanted to know there are actually a few planning board members here this evening. It's nice to see them all in attendance because we have been discussing Waterfront West at length, as well as the City Council. To improve the public access to the waterfront through Waterfront West in a more defined way, I would say, than the boatyards that are there today. And also to expand public parks and civic spaces along the waterfront. So in addition to a harbor walk, could there be a public plaza or things like that? For Waterfront West, there's a couple of areas in that plan that we're focused on. So for Waterfront West, I'm just going to summarize some of those real quick. For land use, we wanted to reflect, the city has said it wants to reflect the historic character of downtown Newburyport, and I know we can all debate over what that means, and I'll get into that a little bit here, but we also need to reevaluate, is that the same today? Are there some adjustments we need to make? Ensuring a vibrant mix of uses, I think that's consistent with the downtown. We have commercial uses generally on the first floors and residential above or offices above. And that consistency was essentially expressed in this plan as something that the city wanted to have happen in Waterfront West as well. So that means active ground first floor uses. We call that, we planners call it active frontage. That means the frontage of the buildings activates public spaces, whether it be a sidewalk or a public park. Allowing residential uses above, that's pretty typical of our downtown. And then also, there was a discussion of Market Street essentially being extended to the water's edge with a slight angle. And then McKay's Way, as we refer to it today, also being a way to the water's edge and activating those as best we can. Ensuring sufficient parking for all the uses that are required, and then encouraging, if possible, structured or underground parking, similar to what the city has done with the parking garage to try to reduce parking on the central waterfront. We've tried to consolidate the footprint of parking, and that was one of the goals established in that 2003 plan for Waterfront West, so that Waterfront West would not be largely covered with parking lots. And create a framework of streets that is somewhat coherent, like the downtown that we have with Market Square and State Street, for instance. So this is a schematic plan that was actually in the 2003 plan, and I think there's a couple of things that are worth note here. I realize that you don't all look at these plans like I do every day. So this is Market Street, a little extension off of Market Street. So that's Market Street today. This is Merrimack Street. Merrimack River's right here. That's Route 1. And there was a schematic plan put in that plan to illustrate what the city might desire, consistent with some of the text of the document, which is essentially block-style formation of the buildings, rather than having circulation patterns of cars going around all the buildings, to really have a hierarchy of pedestrian ways and vehicular ways and blocks of buildings. So as you look at Market Square, for instance, that's not one building or one commercial use, it's actually blocks of buildings put together that create the frontage that you see in a definable way. So that was something that was expressed in this plan here by those two ways right here. This is McKay's Way right here. And it was proposed that there be a wharf street of some type down here, basically being a pedestrian, vehicular, and bicycle circulation path east and west, similar to the temporary path that's there today through the boatyard, but something more permanent. And one thing that is of note in that plan actually is that it presumed in that plan that on the water side there that this area here would be largely a marina use or public access. It was not assumed in that plan that there'd be much in terms of buildings going on here. I know that in the New England development proposal, which we'll get to in a few moments, there was a proposal for some buildings in that area. And again, this is, there is no absolute necessarily a right or wrong with these things, but it's a question of balancing out multiple public objectives. So the question of whether or not NED's plan today or tomorrow is consistent with that is something we need to evaluate against the old measures, but also to evaluate whether or not those measures have changed for us as a city. Waterfront West, for the public streets and walks, we talked about extending essentially Merrimack Street with consistent blocks down to the river. The lateral streets generally being framed by tight buildings, consistent with what we have, for instance, on In Street or even State Street, and framing the views of the water where possible. Extending Market Street to the water, extending McKay Street or McKay's Way to the water, a wharf street along the water's edge. This was a highlight, like I said, in that plan with active frontage, so commercial uses like cafes, shops, and things like that would help to create a vibrant public space as opposed to a dead public space. And creating a plaza for public events, activities, and vendors. And then some design guidelines for the architecture to make sure it's that the regulations can require through the planning board's review process that New England Development or any future developer of that land creates architecture that is consistent with our downtown. So that's what the design guidelines are essentially for. One thing that's important in downtowns is something that we planners call zero lot line setbacks. That means you don't necessarily want to have, for instance, up in Port Plaza, for instance, there are buildings that are set back from the street. That area is largely designed for automobiles to come in, for plenty of parking, and then for people to walk up to the building's edge. In this scenario, we have our downtown, and consistent with what happened when urban renewal took place, the city pushed back on having basically the historic buildings torn down and parking lots created for strip mall type development. We want to recreate in Waterfront West, and the city has said this in numerous plans over the years, to create buildings that come up to the sidewalk edge and recreate the downtown as opposed to having it be a setback that creates an awkward situation for the pedestrian. So continuous street facades with firewalls similar to the buildings you see here. This is just an example, I think, Blue on State Street. Facade articulation, so that means that, you know, in this building here, there's going to be some differentiation, whether it be setting forward or back the facades of the building, the fenestration, the location of windows, and the amount of those on the first floor being important. You want to have some transparency, for instance, for shops. The front doors being on public ways, and the access ways for cars, for service, vehicles going behind. That was important for the city back in 2003, and it was also discussed, and I'll explain this in a future slide, was discussed by the committee for Waterfront West when it was reviewing the NED plans from last year and this year, because it's important to have the pedestrian prioritized generally in a downtown as opposed to the automobile. The automobile still needs to be parked, but you don't want to emphasize the automobile over the pedestrian. So there was also a building height emphasized as a 35-foot maximum, which essentially equates to a 3-story building. There was allowance or assumption that there'd be allowance for greater height on the downhill side. So as you know, the slope to the river goes down. And so the assumption there was, well, you could possibly have a little bit greater height there since it could be nestled in that slope. The traditional patterns of windows and doors, like I said, being maintained, and that there was an assumption in that waterfront strategic plan that we primarily push for predominantly brick and slate roofing, for instance, but I know materials are a smaller component than, let's say, of density or overall character. Parking, there was an allowance or an assumption in that plan that the allowance for parking within 500 feet of new buildings, that would allow some flexibility, allow parking footprints to be consolidated while still providing the necessary parking. That New England Development in this case would have to provide for their own uses, not using any city parking lots. Encourage the underground and structured parking, again, to reduce the footprint of parking. that 50% of the ground floor level or first floor level of parking garages would be activated, so you wouldn't see through to the garage, you'd actually see an active frontage there that's beneficially contributing to the streetscape. And then ramps to underground parking being hidden, for instance. Implementing the 2003 Waterfront Strategic Plan was part of the Waterfront West Overlay District. That was the key impetus behind the 2004 Waterfront Overlay District, was to implement a number of the recommendations of that plan, and basically focusing on where the developer comes in and says, I want to do a project. The zoning is there to basically make sure that the project comes out the way the city wants. And so the zoning of the Waterfront West Overlay District was adopted to implement some of the criteria established in that 2003 plan. So establishing the character of the building patterns, the setbacks, the height, the density, et cetera, was part of that, and it's outlined in this ordinance that's a subset of the city's zoning ordinance. Establishing the yard setback requirements, the build-to line or the zero lot line requirements for it that are typical in a downtown, encouraging mixed-use buildings with active first-floor uses, promoting a lively mix of those uses, and maintaining the marine-dependent uses along the waterfront, consistent with the state's Chapter 91 requirements. Discouraging expansive use of parking lots, like I said earlier, shared parking being allowed on case-by-case scenario, looking at basically where you have parking lots that might be used during the day by certain uses and night by other uses, and not having basically an excessive amount of parking there. It's not beneficial in general to a downtown to have seas of parking. So what you want to do generally is consolidate that footprint, and where parking lots are underutilized, make sure that there's overlapping uses of those parking spaces rather than doubling up on spaces, which actually detracts from the pedestrian experience in a downtown. And that was emphasized in that overlay district, similar to the 2003 plan. Preserving historic structures, structures that are deemed historically significant through adaptive reuse, and then encouraging affordable housing. So there's a requirement for affordable housing, a percentage of affordable housing in the Waterfront West overlay district today. So this is the zoning district that's on the books today for Waterfront West before New England Development came in and said, we'd like to do something a little different. That overlay district does not work for us. There's a 4-acre requirement for access to the Waterfront West Overlay District as a special permit. So what some people may not realize is that the Waterfront West Overlay District is unlike some other districts where you can apply for some other exceptions in that overlay district. In this case, you actually have to have 4 acres to come in. So the assumption here with this overlay district, and this is something that I think is beneficial to the city, to be able to work with one developer, whether it's New England Development or another developer, one developer on that central waterfront area of Waterfront West, because if you don't work with one developer, you might, or you're very likely to end up with piecemeal development that does not work cohesively together. So by my mind, as a planner, there's a benefit, and there's a reason why this was established as a threshold, to make sure that whether it was New England Development or some other entity came in with a holistic plan for that area. That doesn't mean that the plan that's being proposed, today is the right one, but it means that there was an attempt to have a coherent plan for all of that property, as opposed to having, for instance, the discussion of each building individually, which may not coordinate with adjacent sites, public access, the architecture, things like that. There was a building height a limit of 35 feet of 3 stories and 40 feet for parking structures adjacent to Route 1, with an allowance for 40-foot buildings perpendicular to the river where there's a commercial or quasi-public use on the first floor. 33% open space requirement that excluded public streets. And then parking was to be provided by the applicant within 500 feet for commercial or hotel uses and 300 feet for residential uses. Shared parking would be allowed subject to review and approval by the planning board, which had sole discretion on whether to grant that or not. Challenges for New England Development, I'm sure we can point out some other things, but some things that are worth noting. New England Development, and this is not atypical of Newburyport zoning, we're actually working to clean up some of the processes in our zoning ordinance right now more holistically, but New England Development had pointed out that in the Waterfront West Overlay District, for some of the things that they'd like to do there's a question of which permit entities might be the ones required to approve the project. In this case, there is actually the potential for overlapping jurisdiction between the planning board and the ZBA, and so just as a matter of efficiency for the end result as the city wants, I, for instance, would agree that it makes sense to have one board do that review process in general, rather than having 2 boards that might have 2 different conflicting opinions and 2 different results that come out of that process. Discretionary permitting, New England Development has taken the stance that for project financing, it's beneficial to know up front what might be allowed. So they've, for instance, proposed this master plan that would allow them, once they've proposed that master plan and it's been adopted by the city council through the zoning process, that they could come in essentially through each building through the project, through the planning board for permitting. But because it's not discretionary, it's something that's then, quote, as of right after that original adoption of the zoning, as long as they are consistent with all the requirements under zoning, they know that they can again go to the banks, get the financing for the project. There isn't this question mark for developers or for the banks in financing a project in wondering whether or not future phases or future developments might be permittable. The zoning basically speaks to it up front, and that's what New England Development has proposed in 2017, and then again picking up the conversation in 2018. The allowed uses, there's a little bit of a conflicting in the use table and in the Waterfront West Overlay District, some conflicting definitions or treatment of uses, whether it be a hotel, a multifamily by special permit, mixed use by right. That's a nuanced thing that I think is probably more palatable to folks like myself, like a planning staff. But the 4-acre minimum, obviously, they propose a slightly smaller area than the Waterfront West Overlay District, like I said, but there's a high threshold there for area, and even just to be eligible for this Waterfront West Overlay District special permit. Frontage of 60 feet, the argument was that it encourages larger lots and development scale. Smaller scale frontage might be more appropriate. We obviously have buildings in the downtown that have small frontage along the storefronts. A height allowance of 35 to 40 feet. Their concern there is that it does not allow for the flood zones, so the flood maps have changed and flood conditions have gotten worse. And there's obviously assumptions about storm surge, climate change, things like that. So they've expressed concern that they cannot, with those flood zones, then create the 3-story height buildings and still stay within the heights concern that the city has in terms of heights. And then density threshold, New England Development, I'll let them speak to that on their own, but there's a increase in number of the units that we've gone back and forth over a couple of different numbers over the last year or two, but they have a concern that there's a threshold that I'll let them speak to, but a threshold in which the project is financeable or not financeable. And so they've expressed concern that if the threshold is too low, the project cannot be done, and therefore they would not be able to do a coherent site layout or project there. It might be done in piecemeal over the years, whether by them or someone else. This is a graphic that was presented by NED in one of their presentations, I think both last year, but certainly this year. And the bottom line is that because of the flood zones, which are shaded there for the Waterfront West area in these different colors, buildings have to be elevated. Oh, sorry. Let's see, yeah. So the point here is that in elevation 14, so this is the darker shaded area here, that buildings need to be 5 to 6.5 feet above existing ground surface. Same thing with the elevation 13 zone, that they need to be 4 to 5.5 feet above existing ground surface. And sorry about that. Just apologize for that. So they need to elevate the floor level. The bottom line is they need to elevate the floor level of the buildings in order to stay above those flood zones. Those are actually requirements that come down from the federal government, come down from the state government, and are adopted here locally under zoning. And structurally, they have to have the buildings above that. So that creates, I think, as a planner and an urban planner with an urban design background, the problem that creates is you might not be able to create the same types of public space as you originally expected along the water's edge, or the fill would need to be added, or the buildings would need to be elevated. And that's the point to consider there along the water's edge. It may not be at the grade that we originally thought it would be to make it work. And we need to consider both those flood zones, the allowances that we have for height, and how do we make something that's viable in that area given those constraints. Key provisions of the 2017 proposal by New England Development. They proposed, like I said, to modify the area involved in the Waterfront West Overlay District. They proposed a schematic master plan. And the important part of that, like I was saying, is that the good thing for the city is that up front we have a layout of Waterfront West. New England Development gave us a layout last year. That layout essentially changed in prior, I'll show that in a few seconds, but the slide that I'll show in a second shows the layout from 2017 and then how it changed in 2018. But having a master plan for the overall site is beneficial to the city in that we know what we're going to get up front in terms of the layout of the site. If absent that, we have the typical typical process we have here in Newburyport elsewhere, where someone comes in piecemeal and does a project or a property at a time. So New England Development, the benefit for them in having a master plan site is that they know up front what might be allowed by the city, and then they can go out and get financing for it. So there's benefits on both sides of having a so-called master plan of the site. They propose that that master plan be incorporated in the zoning, and that it call out things like where building footprints or envelopes might be, what certain requirements might be for parking, et cetera. They proposed in 2017 a phased development scheme where they would work on one building at a time. They proposed an as-of-right permit process, meaning once the zoning is adopted and it's outlined a number of different provisions to make sure we get what we want as a city, that they can come back then and get a conformance review by the planning board. The planning board would have jurisdiction then to determine whether or not what they're proposing is consistent with that zoning, and could not approve the project unless it was consistent with that zoning. At that point, they would then be able to go forward and get building permits for their project. The 8 buildings that were originally proposed, that layout, which I'll show in a second, some of the problems with that layout that the committee of the planning board and city council pointed out was that it really didn't have a coherent front or back to the buildings. There was no defined blocks like we have, for instance, at Market Square, where the individual uses are joined and you have a sense of public space versus the back space behind buildings where service might happen. And it was confusing vehicular circulation patterns around all the buildings. That's not good for a downtown generally. There were 3 major ways or wharfs, Brown's Wharf, McKay's Wharf, and Tournament Wharf being extended. And they're built out, although we've seen different numbers. I myself have seen different numbers, and I've heard other people referring to different numbers. This is generally the build out that they were proposing, the heights of buildings and the number of parking spaces being discussed at that time. So for 2017, this is just some illustrations again to recap for you what New England Development was proposing at that time. One of the concerns that was raised at that time was the volume of the buildings and the blocky style of those buildings, in the sense that they're sort of straight volumes but didn't have much articulation to them. And as you'll notice here, there are fingers extending down to the river's edge. That is somewhat consistent with the wharf-style development that happened historically here. But there's debate about the volume or the style of those buildings, and whether or not the layout makes sense for the pedestrian. So these are some illustrations that they had back in 2017 along the water's edge. This is actually Merrimack Street. So as you're approaching the downtown, the city's new parking garage is actually right about here. That's Horton's Yard right there. And what they proposed for that is buildings along Merrimack Street. This would be opposite the garage, essentially, and you can actually make out the garage structure there. 4-story structure here this would be McKay's Way, or sorry, this is actually Tournament Wharf, I think, going down, accessing into the site. So those are the multi-story buildings there. This is looking down Tournament Wharf. So this is looking down basically as you go towards Michael's Harborside down the end there. The Route 1 bridge is here. And this is the illustration showing what that would look like with the buildings essentially on the east side of that. This property is not under their control, and then Michael's is under their control, but it's down here at the end here. It was not the subject of this zoning discussion here. There's a comparison that I think needs to be made between the 2017 plan by New England Development and the 2003 strategic plan that was adopted by the city. So I've just put these 2 layouts side by side. This is the 2017 plan. I have a slide here that I'll show on the 2018 plan where it's been revised a bit, but there's a little bit of inconsistency here that the committee had pointed out, and New England Development was told to go home and work on the plan, and that happened over the last year or so. There was some work that New England Development did, which I'll show in a moment. But what they did was, these buildings, like I said, were isolated. There was less coherence to the site in terms of where the pedestrians go, where the vehicles go, or do people just circulate every building, and that isn't necessarily a good circulation pattern for the downtown. So the 2003 plan assumed that things would be arranged in blocks, similar to what we have, where pedestrians know where to go. These are the primary access ways for them. There are nestled parking areas or spaces behind that that are less dominant, let's say, for the pedestrian. And then there was a definition of a wharf street of some type down here. And one notable exception or difference in this plan was that in the 2003 plan, there was an assumption made at that time that the marina itself would have some sort of active boating activity down here, or at least the public space down here would be somewhat separated from vehicular circulation that would happen just along here and not go too much further towards the water's edge. In New England Development's proposal, there is a little bit of an overlap there between some boating access to the small lift that would be maintained there, the vehicular parking that might be there, and then the pedestrians going back and forth. That's a little bit different. It's not just different because New England Development's plan is different, it's also because the assumption back in 2003 was slightly different as to what that area would be used for. That plan also in 2003 did not, at least in a major way, contemplate buildings down there like these, so it assumed that there might be less structures or no structures down there. The 2018 proposal by New England Development, again, a revised version of the 2017 plan, again, had a modified area for Waterfront West Overlay District, or at least the area they were concerned about changing the zoning for. It still had a schematic site plan that would be incorporated into the zoning, and we never got to the really nitty-gritty part of the zoning text because we were really, as a collective, the city council, the planning board, the staff, all of us, we're focused primarily on seeing whether the project itself made sense, because there's not a whole lot of point in working on the text of zoning unless you know the project is going to work. So we spent a lot of time working on the schematic site layout and the renderings of that. They had a phased development that was eliminated. They basically said, we'd like to do this whole project at once. We understand your concerns about phasing the project over multiple years and the impact that might have on the downtown. So they suggested removing the phasing element of that project. Again, the as-of-right process with a conformance review by the planning board. They have essentially five buildings at this point, arranged in blocks with a better or more clear front and back to the buildings, better vehicular and circulation patterns, at least towards the Merrimack Street side of the site. There's some debate, obviously, with different people having different opinions about the water side or edge of that. But on the upper hill part, I think that circulation pattern works better. Then again, they had the three ways reaching down the water's edge and some adjustment in the number of units that are being proposed, again, with 3-, 4-, and 5-story buildings. Sorry. And this is just an illustration from their most recent presentation showing the 3 by the water's edge, 4- and 5-story buildings that they were proposing uphill. And largely what they're proposing is active frontage uses on the first floor around this plaza. Down here, there's some steps to get above the flood zones, some steps right in here. Details to be worked out on something like that, obviously. The hotel is proposed most recently by New England Development, has a little bit of a bridge structure between that. I think it was a 3-story element sharing just over vehicular circulation to connect those two structures and make the hotel a viable structure. And then they have, obviously, stepping up towards Merrimack Street, 4- and then 5-story buildings. The comparison of floor area ratios, I have not myself been able to do the comparison on this, but this is a slide that New England Development proposed, and what they were attempting to show through this slide here is, as a comparison to the downtown that we have today, what we call floor area ratio, meaning the type of density that we have, how does Waterfront West as an area that they're proposing to work in compare to other areas that we have in our downtown? And while floor area ratio wasn't something that was necessarily discussed directly in the 2003 strategic plan or the Waterfront West Overlay District, the result is it comes down to essentially what does the volume look like of that area. So in Market Square, the ratio being 1.1, then State Street and Pleasant Street, the ratio being 1.2, almost the same, and Brown Square being about 0.9, and Waterfront West, they're proposing about 1.35. Their proposed density is a little bit higher than what we have elsewhere in the downtown. I know that's been one of the major discussion points, probably the main discussion point about New England Development's proposal for Waterfront West is what is the density they're proposing, and is that the right mixture? So their threshold was a little bit higher in Waterfront West than what we have in the other areas, but they were trying to show that it's somewhat similar to or close to the 1.1 or 1.2. This is an illustration of the downtown waterfront looking from the Route 1 bridge, the Gillis Bridge, and then New England Development superimposed on top of that their buildings. So you can see what does that look like. Does it maintain some of the historic steeples that you can see in the background there, and what do the buildings look like there? Obviously, details of buildings are something that are worked out in a later phase usually, but there was plenty of discussion about articulation of the buildings, whether or not all the volumes were articulated, and whether the buildings step back. But there was a concern there from the committee, both of the city council and the planning board, that the skyline be preserved, and they were attempting to show there how that skyline is preserved above the buildings they're proposing. In the 2018 proposal from New England Development, they revised the site layout primarily in response to feedback that came from the planning board and the city council through that shared working group or committee. And largely that change happened up in this area here, where instead of having individual buildings that are like fingers extending down, New England Development then blocked the buildings to create more definable blocks like we have, for instance, with Market Square, where the building sort of wraps the corner there. And this becomes a unified whole where pedestrians understand that this is the way that they would walk down each of these ways, and that this is the public space down here, and there would be less confusion about, for instance, private parking spaces nestled behind there, or service entries and things like that, where you don't want to see those things in the major public way. And again, in reference to the 2003 strategic plan, there was a different assumption at that time about what would happen down here, and that's not to prejudice one way or the other, but there was an assumption that there would be less buildings down here, and that there would be perhaps a defining line by this wharf way, that the vehicular circulation would largely end down here and not extend to the water's edge. New England Development has proposed both some parking down there, which actually isn't entirely inconsistent with that plan, but there was, to the extent or where it's shown, is a little bit different. As you can see, there's some spaces here, and this plan largely assumed that that parking might end along this way right here. And again, that it was not an assumption at that time anyway that there would be buildings along the water's edge, although I don't, for instance, have an opposition per se to buildings. It's more of a question of the details. The subcommittee evaluation criteria, this is another measure. It's not a plan that was adopted by the city, but it's a summary document that is posted on the city's website, but it was established by the subcommittee. Lee McGavin was the chair, and there were some representatives from the planning board and from the planning development committee of the city council. They met on a number of instances, and then again with New England Development, you heard them outline at prior public meetings some of the key criteria that they wanted to use to measure the Waterfront West proposal by New England Development. And this was essentially a synopsis of that, several pages, some of the highlights. So for instance, the height of the buildings, to make it essentially compatible with downtown, the assumption was that New England Development's buildings should be 3 to 4 stories with a limited allowance for 5-story where it's justified, on a case-by-case review as opposed to wholesale, and that we ensure that the skyline is preserved. Density, that it be consistent with the downtown. We can measure that in different ways, but that's general premise, is that it be somewhat consistent with the downtown. That public space be meaningful public space as opposed to little piecemeal things here and there. For instance, a public plaza that's a reasonable size to actually have functions or activities. That it be high quality, and that it be somewhat limited conflict between the cars and the boats. That was an area of concern. The buildings themselves, that they be high quality, that they be articulated volumes as opposed to being a large monolithic block. They'd be varied heights as opposed to one single height, like the earlier 2017 rendering that I showed you from New England Development had buildings that were 4 or 5 stories and largely looked like big blocks. That was not something that was desired by the committee, and I don't think is necessarily beneficial to the downtown, so having some variation is important. And articulating those buildings, those roof lines, is important as well. Having welcoming public entrances, and the revised site layout, I think, improved upon that from last year because it really better defines where the public entrance is to each of these buildings. Parking, there's a discussion obviously about the ratio of parking required by New England Development for this project or any other developer for Waterfront West, but the assumption was that New England Development should provide all parking needed for its market demand on site. We can obviously debate over what ratios make sense, but the assumption is that rather than relying on parking elsewhere or not providing it, they'd have to provide that parking, and we'd have some discussion with a consultant over where is the right threshold. Streets, that be a clear hierarchy or front and back. The traffic, that they be able to handle the traffic patterns on site, and that we'd have a peer review of that. We started the peer review process last year. We figured we would pick that up again this year. We were still waiting for the revised traffic analysis from New England Development from where they left off last year, which I think they've probably completed that process, but we have not yet received the analysis. But that is largely a more detailed discussion of both on-site traffic patterns and circulation, not only for vehicles but also for pedestrians, but also on Merrimack Street off-site, where cars are coming and going and running into other cars that are coming to the downtown. And there's a particular focus, I think, on the Route 1 intersection at Merrimack Street for us. The hotel, there's a question there about whether or not it's a commitment by NED, or are they demonstrating that it's a non-viable option. They've shown in their plans a hotel. I think there's a question there as to whether or not it's an obligation on their part versus an option. That's something for us to discuss. And there was a discussion in the committee about it being along the water's edge as opposed to up on Merrimack Street. And there's different opinions about where that might be best sited, but the committee, I think, leaned towards the idea of having it along the water's edge. Obviously, better views down there. The marina, that it be preserved. and the boating access and storage be addressed. So while we know the boats are stored there during the day right now or off season, on the waterfront there, the boat storage is not necessary per se to a downtown. There's a desire there for some to have that active marina activity or boating storage on the waterfront as a reference visually, but it's not necessary per se for a downtown. So one of the concerns that we had when we brought our harbor master out to meet with us on site to talk about the impact or potential impact of the marina was, what happens if this boat storage goes away? What happens if the large boat lift goes away and it's only the small lift? And in the end of the discussion, in a nutshell, the harbor master determined that he did not think that this project was going to have a negative detriment on the boating community or the maritime community, that the boating storage could be kept, upriver, essentially off-site here. What mattered really, I think, was that the marina stay, that the small lift was being kept there so that the smaller craft could come in and out. But he did not feel that the relocation of the boat storage was going to be an impact to the boating community, and that was a concern that the council president and others wanted to hash out with the harbor master to get his sense of how that would work or not work. So that's a quick synopsis of those. Some areas for consideration, I think, for the council, and these are not all the areas for consideration, but some I think that are important based on all the issues that have been discussed to date, and a comparison of the strategic plan from 2003, the zoning ordinance from 2004, the wing development proposals, and the very discussions that we have as city officials over the years. Whether or not there's a cohesive site plan or there's isolated parcels that are developed, as planning director, I hope that there's something that can be done cohesively. I don't really care whether it's wing development or some other entity, but I think it's best if we can come up with a plan that's cohesive so that the whole of Waterfront West works together for us as a city, rather than having each developer do their own thing, which sometimes results in, particularly in sprawl scenarios out, in more suburban areas, can result in a very disconnected area for people. So in a downtown, you really want to have those things work together. I think there's a benefit for us to try to work and have one plan that works together, regardless of who does it. The building heights, there's a question there about what the building height should be, whether it be 3 stories, 4 stories, 5 stories, a combination, and where those might be appropriate or not, and the perceived volume that creates. That, I think, is probably, from the discussions I've seen all across the board, is probably the main focus of discussion. Then that relates to the development density, the unit count. The commercial space, the Waterfront West Overlay District, again, assumed that the majority of the first floor of the buildings would be commercial uses or active frontage uses. New England Development has suggested that less than that would be appropriate. I think the committee, I don't want to speak for the committee, but I think through the committee's discussions there was an understanding or an agreement generally that what was proposed was appropriate in the most recent round, about 10,000 square feet of commercial space, largely focusing on Merrimack Street and the river's edge, where the public spaces are, and to a lesser extent in between the ways like McKay's Way, Tournament Wharf, or Brown's Wharf leading down there, because those are short walks between those two primary street frontages. But it's important to have activation, so we wanted to make sure there was enough of that, and the most recent proposal is about 10,000 square feet in total. Parking requirements, whether there's enough that's provided, whether the ratios are appropriate, and whether or not the shared parking allowances are reasonable. Traffic improvements and pedestrian connectivity, whether that works both on the site as well as its relationship to Merrimack Street and the rest of the downtown. Whether or not the hotel is a requirement or an option for NED, whether or not there's a threshold for size, the type of the hotel, whether it has conference space, those are all considerations for us, and maybe a question for the council in terms of a development agreement. The architectural compatibility, there's different design standards that could be implemented, both some of the current standards in the Waterfront West Overlay District, but other more detailed requirements. We have, for instance, in our 40R district, which is down by the train station, there are specific design guidelines for the architecture to make sure that the buildings don't look like large monolithic blocks, have an appropriate amount of window space on the first floor, and things like that. So I won't go into that in more detail, but to have certain design standards and what those standards should be. And then public benefits. What are the public benefits? What type of public space? Is there a public plaza? Is there a harbor wagon extension? What sort of traffic improvements are proposed or being funded? And is the hotel, for instance, something that's going to happen as a result of this project, or is it something that may or may not happen? There's lots of other considerations, I'm sure, but those are some of the major ones that I think are worthwhile for the council to consider in its debate over the Waterfront West proposal from NED or any other entity going forward. So with that, I think it's a question of where does the council want to go with this?
I think we'd like to start with our questions from councilors of the planning director, so that if there's something you weren't sure about as he raced through it, we can clarify. Councilor Seed?
May I stay seated for my questions?
Yeah,
Okay,
and-
thanks.
I'm going to dispense with some of the council rules for the purposes of this discussion. Remain seated, take your jackets off if you feel overheated, please. We'll follow Robert's rules roughly, but
Okay.
I'd like this to be a little more open discussion. Go
I
ahead.
have a few questions for you. So one is, try and go in order here. One thing I didn't see you mention in the current Waterfront West Overlay District, which I've read several times now, trying to understand it better, is there's a section in here that talks about minimum lot area being 5,000 square feet. And when I first read that, I was really surprised that it was low, seemed low. Can you just tell me if the vision of the 2003 master, so 5,000 square feet on a 5-acre site or a 4-acre minimum means you could have, by my back of the napkin math, between 30 and 40 lots that would equate to 5,000, assuming you just took the square footage, you didn't just carved it up. So to me, when I read that, my concern was it'd be awful strange to have 30 lots, 30 buildings on that space, even if they were only 35 feet tall. Am I reading it correctly, basically?
I would agree, and I think that's the reason why the committee was pushing towards the block-style creation, even though there might be smaller units that are 5,000 square feet or, within the vertical volume, that they be created more like blocks.
Because 5,000 is actually less than some of our residential districts, if I have that correct.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I read that correct. Second question is, the second thing that I thought was interesting, and you mentioned it, is the open space requirement excludes public streets. But one of the big debates, I think, is whether the streets are going to be public or private, because there are implications for the city having to take care of the streets. So if they are private ways, or if some of them are private ways, then they count, that they can count towards that open space requirement. Am I reading it correctly?
Yeah, I want to speak for those who were here back when I wasn't here, and I don't want to speak to their intentions, but I think the primary issue is whether or not those streets are publicly accessible. From all the discussions that I've been privy to during the last 8 years that I've been here, I think my understanding is that most city officials would prefer New England Development or whoever owns that land to maintain and upkeep all of those improvements, the roadway, et cetera, the sidewalks, et cetera, but that the city and the general public have public access through those ways to the water's edge.
So do you think that the overlay district, though, that would be counted towards open space? That's basically the heart of my question is, because I agree. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to take care of more streets, especially for a proponent, but at the same time, you got
Yeah.
two conflicting things there. If,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
in
those are
it is a
divergent.
good point, because in the 2003 strategic plan, I think there was an assumption that, in the 2004 zoning, there was an assumption that these ways would not really count towards that public space, that really the water's edge was where most of that public space might happen, and where it would be, quote, meaningful. In the presentation from New England Development, I know that they had taken some credit for some space, for instance, over here, and there's obviously debate about how meaningful can that public space be if there is too much conflict with vehicles going back and forth or boats going back and forth. So I know that, well, I do think as a planner that this space, although there's debate about building heights and details and things like that with steps, I do think a plaza like this would be beneficial to this public space and to this downtown area. What's more subject to debate maybe is areas like this where it sort of bleeds off into a roadway, and there might be some parking circulation patterns, and whether that can functionally be meaningful public space or whether it's a subordinate area.
But bottom line is that private ways could or would count towards the open space. I mean, it's a pretty plainly written sentence. It just says 33% of the area excluding public
Excluding
streets.
public,
It doesn't
right.
say anything. It's not very specific as far as, if you have a street okay, so that's my next question. My next one is, I'm very confused about the minimum street frontage versus the setbacks. So I did read there's a 60-foot minimum street frontage, but then it also says there's 0 lot lines. And then you were saying that we were confused about what's the front, back, and side of the building. So this is an important one for how close, it goes back to my first question about acreage and lot sizes. 60 feet from what? Like, that's the front of the building, and then to what street? To a private way or to Merrimack Street? Or what is the street frontage? How would we define that in this context?
Yeah, so frontage generally, and especially for those in the public, frontage is generally the length along the right-of-way, so that obviously this isn't one building, this is obviously attached structures, but a frontage is essentially the length along the roadway there, whereas a setback is the number of feet from the public way back to the building itself. Generally in the downtown, like I was saying earlier, generally in a downtown, you want to bring the buildings up to the streetscape because that's where you have your shops, you want people to be able to walk in and out. You don't want to have a 20-foot setback like you might have in a residential district, for instance, like the West End.
So the vision was every building would have a minimum of 60 feet. And what's a good example of a building? Can you think of one that's 60 feet for me, so I can get a sense for?
I can't off the top of my head. I'm trying to think, give me a second, I'll
right.
find something that's a good comparison.
Next one is height. So the feet versus stories keeps coming up. So 40 feet in real life, how many is that basically equate to 3 or 4 stories? Is
It's
it
a 3 with, it really depends
10
on
feet?
grading, it depends on the definition of how the height is measured, whether it's from average mean grade and whether or not it goes to the peak of the roof versus the mean height of the roof. But you can basically get between 3 and 4 stories. It really depends on how creative the architect is and how much they can work with the grade, depending on whether there's a sloped grade of the site that they're dealing with.
And do you think having parking on the first floor changes that formula, or you're still going to basically, parking floor is going to be?
I definitely think it's one of the major conflicts we have with Waterfront West is I think we need to, as a city, reconcile the fact that it probably is not realistic. If we're not adding a significant amount of fill to this area, I think we need to assume that there needs to be some greater height allowance to allow for, 1, underground or first-level parking nested behind the buildings, and 2, the flood zones. So I think we have these sort of competing objectives of keeping the buildings short and the flood zones pushing up from the bottom. And NED is essentially saying we need some height in there, we need some allowance in there to make this project work financially or even as a space. And so I think we do need to allow some credit for that area underneath. The question is where that threshold is.
But I guess what I'm asking is a parking story is roughly the same size as a story that would be used for commercial. So the
Yes.
40 feet it's still 3 to 4 stories, somewhere in there, depending on how you slice it.
More or less.
Okay. And then 2 more. One is the sequencing, the way that overlay district handles the sequencing, in my read, is just that basically every condition has to be met at every step of the sequence, but they clearly envisioned that sequencing was going to happen here.
Yes.
So as long as the proponent keeps 33% open space at every step of the project, they're complying with Waterfront West. Is that?
Right, and there was generally an assumption there through the zoning that there'd be essentially a master plan or a master layout for the site, and that there'd be implementation in each phase would meet, like you said, that threshold for open space, for instance.
Okay. And then my last question is, does overlay district at all talk about, I didn't see anything that talked about density, that said, here's a maximum number of units or a minimum number of units. I didn't see anything, even the word density, I don't even think appears anywhere in the text. So I'm assuming that it's whatever can fit on the site is what.
Correct. With all those, that's exactly right. With all the dimensional requirements that are in play in the zoning ordinance in that section, which I didn't summarize everything, of course, but with those dimensional requirements, essentially the architect and engineer have to go back and see how much they can fit in there. They go back and sometimes adjust the sizes of rooms or the sizes of units even to work out the numbers. But some ordinances actually have, although we don't have it here, we are talking about in our zoning rewrite for the whole city. We don't use the term full area ratio universally across the city, but we are discussing that. Full area ratio largely defines how much volume you might have on a site, whereas the number of units per acre might define how many units you could fit in there based on comparison to Market Square or some other area. And those are 2 numbers to compare. But you're right. Here you step into how many units you can fit by looking at the dimensional setback.
And the other, like the parking might be.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Those are all constraints, and within those constraints, you narrow
Whatever
down the
falls
box.
out the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Other councilors, questions for the planning director? Councilor Shand?
Does the development plan drive the zoning, or does the zoning drive the development plan?
I'll say definitively, in my opinion, the zoning should drive the development plan. So, and that's not to say that the zoning that's in place today, the 2004 zoning, is the correct zoning to have. I do agree that some flexibility or modifications to that might be appropriate. Where that line is, I think, is subject to some debate. But I do think that the city should be driving the bus as to what should happen there and making sure that NED's plan conforms to that. I do think some adjustments to the Waterfront West Overlay District would be reasonable, but I do think that we should be essentially be dictating what's best for our downtown, and NED should be conforming to that.
Additional questions? Follow? Other councilors? Councilor Augerman?
Well, one suggestion, it might be good to have Rebecca come sit up here with a mic and sort of explain how the development plan fits in, because it's not something we normally do at the city council. So, and we've never done one when I've been here, but not now necessarily, just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Well, I think this.
By the way, let me just,
I know, having spoken with her previously, I would ask her if there are things about the presentation of the planning director that you think he missed because he was going through a lot of data, going through a lot of observation. And if, is there something you think is important for us to consider? I hope you'll chime in.
say is that the zoning as enacted doesn't really address the councilor's question about sequencing. So,
Yes.
for example, if this were a 3-phase project and there was to be, whatever amount of square footage of open space, and the zoning doesn't dictate that every phase has to meet the 33% minimum. And it may be, in fact, that that's not optimal in the long run, because putting phase 1 and 2 together is going to produce a better result than doing each phase on its own. So you've raised what I think is a very good question. When the city goes to revisit certain parts of the waterfront overlay district zoning, if it so chooses, in relation to the development, and to this councilor's question, I'm sorry, I don't know your name because I'm looking at the back of the nameplate, but yes. In fact, as Andy says, the zoning has to drive what's going to happen in this development, and the notion of putting together a master development plan is very new and would have to be carefully considered by the council and the planning board.
Other councilors? Councilor Shan, did you want to follow on your question, or were you satisfied?
That was good.
Other
Well, I did,
councilors?
actually I did. When it was originally pulled together, it was done by consultant?
The 2003 plan, you mean?
Yeah.
That was done by consultants for the city. It was a grant that was available at the time, I think, from the Seaport Advisory Council from the state. It was used, but it was prepared by consultants with the planning office for the city itself. It was not generated by New England Development, for instance.
Okay.
Other questions? Councilor O'Brien?
Where is the latest plan that you talked about on the radio? Where is that?
That was the 2018 plan that NED had presented. That was the...
No, you didn't talk about 200 units. You talked about something a lot lower and different type.
Okay, oh, I see what your question was.
Yeah.
130.
All this is good, but you know.
Sure.
With all the, in the paper, I think some of the people here want to know what the new one is. These are all the old ones.
Yeah. I will, if I may, the council will indulge me, I'll remain up here instead of having to play this game with Greg to come up and down and answer the councilor's question. I was referring to the 230 units, which was the outside limit of the 2018 NED proposal, and a follow-up conversation that that the chair of the Planning Development Committee and myself, in a meeting with the mayor, the planning director, the chair of the planning board's subcommittee, and NED had, in which Mr. Karp conceded that 230 was too high, and that something, depending on who in the room was speaking, between 130 and 170 was their target at this point, given the kind of feedback they had gotten at a previous meeting on September 5th. So I think that's the range that they're suggesting now, but it wasn't based on, Councilor, it was not based on a specific plan to lay this out. Here's where things are different, more here, fewer there. It was based on a more global comment that Mr. Karp made at that meeting, and I thought it was fair to share that with the public when we had that.
You also talked about different types of buildings, like there wouldn't be the tall one that you talked about. I don't know the word you use. Different types of buildings came out of that meetings. So, you know, it's, none of that's here. You know, if they've changed their mind on all this, well, I think we should know it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know it, we should know it.
Yeah.
That's my feeling. That's all.
I don't profess any specialized knowledge of a new plan that's in the works. I was commenting on the general discussion that we had that resulted in a general agreement that we're going to get together again at some future date, which is not specified yet. Councilor Ackerman.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the meeting, but I didn't hear the radio interview, so maybe I can shed some light. So really, what I took from the meeting was it's really up to the city council to state what we want. And it's just that simple, you know. It's not really up to them at all, NED. I think Mr. Karp, you know, was showing flexibility of some kind, and that's what the president is saying, but they didn't give us any new drawings at all, and we didn't ask for any new drawings. We're kind of done with drawings from them. It was more, let's get our own house in order, and that's what I wanted to talk about when the questions are done is, what's still good from the 2003 strategic plan that doesn't have to change at all? What's still good from the zoning from 2005, I think is the last version? And then decide. And if a majority of us really don't have any interest in changing the zoning, I mean, that's it. Let's move on. And we told that to Mr. Karp, and he understood. So, that's where I would go from here is, I'd maybe get our thoughts on what we think is still good from the old plan and what's not.
May I ask, I don't know who to ask, I think probably Mr. Port, to help us define density, because that's a word that's tossed around quite a bit. In your mind and in the mind of others who are knowledgeable in zoning, does FAR drive density? Is density the number of people per acre in a zone? Is density the ratio of built structure to the overall acreage? What is the best way, and how do we define it so that people have a common understanding?
I do think that the FAR, measures of FAR, floor area ratio, or essentially the volume, what results in the volume, it's a ratio of the volume of the building to the site, and number of units per acre are good measures of density. That being said, I think one of the things that we can debate here in Newburyport and probably go around in circles over is, this is a downtown, so having some level of density, I'm not saying NED's proposal is the right number, but some level of density would be appropriate for Waterfront West, given that it's part of the downtown, and you do want to benefit the downtown by having more residents that can shop, in the shops, for instance, that we have turnover on. So I do think that the FAR is a good way in zoning to measure that and to basically set a box within which the developer needs to abide by, or with a site master plan and looking at each of those building volumes or envelopes that have been created on the plan, set a maximum height, for instance, of what can be allowed there. Those are good ways of defining the volume, but a lot of people tend to think of density in terms of the number of residents that might be living there, and that goes back to, in reality, more of a market analysis the developer does. They look at the zoning, they see what they can do with dimensional requirements, and then they say, how many units can I fit in there? And one of the things they also consider is how many bedrooms, because a one-bedroom unit will take up a lot less space than a three-bedroom unit, and different needs, for instance. So you can't always get. It's sometimes an indirect way of a path to get to the how many units are going to be there. But all those dimensional requirements are ways of getting there. I do think that the height allowances, an FAR requirement, depending on whether we decide to put one in there or not, are good measures under zoning of defining what that volume might be.
Then if I might follow, and perhaps Councilor Zede is going to follow in a similar fashion, is the FAR that's been proposed here, in the latest iteration, it may not be it may not be where we're going in the end, of 1.35, that sounds to me high in comparison to other neighborhoods in the downtown area.
Yes, I would say it's a little high, and I think that it's probably the fifth-story elements, I would say, of the buildings that were proposed is probably contributing to that. But it is a little high, and I think, as you saw, we're sort of at the 1.0 really for the downtown in average, whereas what they're proposing is about a 1.3, 1.35. So I think if they brought that down, they'd probably address the major issue that I have heard here, which is density. And I think if they can address the density issue, there's a lot of other details with this project that could be addressed, but that's the primary one, if they can bring that threshold to a more balance with the rest of the downtown.
Thank you. Councilor Zede, but just a moment. Are other councilors content to sit and listen, or do you have questions you'd like to get in before Councilor Zede goes again? Okay, you're up.
So I want to keep on that same topic. So my question for you is, one of the most interesting things to me was the 17 plan by the proponent was 140, you have it in your slides, I think it was 145 residential units, and then this year it's 220, and 200 to 230, so I go in the middle, say 215. One of the most interesting things is both plans were received as being overly dense, despite the fact that there's almost an 80 unit difference between the two. And then now that maybe they're back in the 130 to 170, just seems back to where we were last year. So what I want to see is the slide you had with the 03 master plan that you were talking about, the shapes of the building. Yep, it was that one, couple more with the orange borders. Yes, this one. So can you explain what did they envision the buildings? I mean, I don't see a lot of buildings. Are those black outlines supposed to be the buildings? Like what?
The buildings are, I mean, these are not, these weren't, this sketch plan, I want to speak for those who drafted it, but, the plan at the time, but these building envelopes, which, might be seen as sort of like, that's a block right there, for instance, that's a block, this was not meant to define exactly what the buildings would be, but more to define where the major public ways might be and the volumes of blocks of buildings might be, to better define the public space, if you will, the public realm. So the assumption is that these might be smaller blocks of buildings or smaller buildings that together create a block.
So clearly the intent, though, was more buildings, a higher number perhaps of buildings, but smaller, shorter buildings.
I don't want to say it was the desire, I think it was more the assumption that, and I think what's important here is that they represent themselves to the pedestrian as volumes that look like blocks, like a neighborhood block in a downtown, as opposed to each building being isolated like the 2017 plan that we saw from New England Development. But I don't think it's necessarily important that, I wouldn't necessarily think it's a good thing to have, like you pointed out earlier, to have 30 separate buildings all in here, everybody doing their own thing and nobody really coordinating with each other either. So I do think there's some benefit to having, units or commercial spaces that might be of this size, for instance, but then having a block of buildings, similar to what you have in Market Square, you have,
So if you apply the 1.0 FAR to this area, how many, what do you estimate the units would be if you applied a 1.0 floor area ratio to this space? Do you come up with less than 100 or 100 units?
No, you come up with more than 100. I don't know exactly where that sweet spot would be, the number would end up being, but I don't think you'd get down as low as, say, 130. I think you'd be somewhere more towards like the 170 range, somewhere in that area.
Councilor Argument?
Yeah, no, if I could, I've been holding back, but I just want to keep it kind of structured on the, so in the 2003 strategic plan, I just think basically 90% of it is fine. It's still sound. I don't know why we'd revisit it. Mm-hmm. The idea is that, you would have, you don't want to do suburban development here. That's axiomatic. It has to be something consistent with the downtown core. The language they used was reinforces the special character of downtown. It doesn't say you have to match it exactly, but the point is we're doing zero lot line setbacks, not suburban. And then, the mix of use ideas is still sound. We don't need to, I don't think we need to revisit that. But, there are some assumptions they made in 2003. They mentioned underground parking several times, which is just not feasible. We've learned that also from all the work we did on the central waterfront. Because of the water table, there's just not enough money to do that. That's crazy. And you need to adjust for it. They had included in 2003 some sectional drawings of roads, and I don't see why we wouldn't look at those again and compare them to whether we want to require that in the zoning. They just have basic widths, and they're modest, because these are wharf streets. And then their concept of the street that goes down the front is, pretty sound. As Andy Port said, it's a little different because it doesn't look like it will be exclusively boating on the water side. We may want to consider allowing buildings on the water side of that new road, but if you look at their cross-section from 2003, they had, a pedestrian area, a parking area, a street area, and a boat area. So, it's not wildly divergent from what I think we would still want to do. Go ahead.
Could I just echo, I think that's a really great point that you raised, because it's the reason that I put these two slides together for the 2018 plan. I realize there's some debate about this public space down here and whether this works, whether things need to be adjusted, but I think there's a lot of similarity in what the committee got out of New England Development from 2017 and what was desired or expressed in the 2003 plan for blocks here.
And it's why, if you go back to the 2017 plan, it's why when we were studying it last year, we weren't really happy with the finger piers, that's historically correct, and that it's perpendicular to the water. The problem is they were kind of scattered and clumped together in a way we didn't like, and we weren't getting a road pattern. In other words, it didn't look like what's on the left.
Right.
And so there, I'm not judging the 2008 plan yet. I'm just saying fundamentally the 2003 block system, I wouldn't want to revisit that. I think it makes sense.
And then, the other obvious difference from 2003 is, just as you can't really do underground parking, the 35 feet matches we have in our code. We measure to the mean average of a curved roof. You don't go to the top of the roof in Newburyport. We would have to change that. We could. So for example, on State Street, those historic buildings, you measure to the midway point of the eave. So that's how they got 35 feet. And the problem here is we have a floodplain. So, maybe we could, that's just the reality is, for good or bad, really all they can do on that first level is park. That's it. Because so far, the state regulations, as I understand it, you can park cars, no one cares about that. But there isn't much else you can do. You can do commercial, NED is worried that that'll change, but for now you can do some commercial too, but you got to elevate it a bit. And then in the zoning that they adopted coming out of the Waterfront West, I guess what I want to make clear to my colleagues is it's not the greatest. It's not, although I'm a fan of the 2003 master plan, the zoning is, it's not as if it's the best thing ever and we should never look at it. The 60-foot wide street frontage for a building is a bit weird. Those buildings on State Street are more like 25. 60 feet is really it's kind of a suburban standard. They may have meant, I wasn't here either in 2004, but they may have meant that the block has to be 60 feet wide. But storefronts in Newburyport are usually much narrower than 60 feet. So that's not great. They had also, you guys were talking about open space. There actually is some tricky language in here. They do decide how you're going to define open space, and it's really liberal. So I wouldn't look to the 33% in the existing zoning and think it's the greatest, because it includes not just what you were talking about, private alleys and sidewalks, but outdoor cafe space, public restrooms, accessible roofs on parking garages. So I mean, it's not, don't be married to this necessarily. And then there are other things in the zoning which make perfect sense and shouldn't be changed, I think. For example, shared parking. So there is an advantage to having, if you have one developer do it and they control all the buildings, you don't have to have, the driveway for the car right underneath each unit. You can get efficiencies by having it within, as they wrote here, 500 feet of a hotel or retailer and 300 feet of a dwelling unit. That's pretty close, actually. In some cities it would be longer. So I guess what I'm saying is there are things I'd like to change in the zoning no matter what we do in order to get development. And then finally, the last slide that Andy had, Waterfront West key areas, I'll just go through them. Yeah, I mean, they wrote this, obviously, if they had a 4-acre minimum in order to even trigger the special permit, they had in mind one developer. Now, an advantage you also have of approving a development plan is then you bind whoever buys the property by contract. So say we do this with New England Development, or we don't, or whatever. It doesn't have to be them. The point is you don't have to rely on any one person. You've got a contract which guarantees you're going to get what you bargained for, and it runs with the land. So I would prefer that. On the building heights where you talked about that, I would want to emphasize where the sort of subcommittee was that Leah McGavern was chairing, because I was on that, is we really are concerned less about a magic number, whether it's 45 feet or 50 feet or 35 feet, than the views. That's why we were really pressing to make sure we know what is this thing going to look like, not just from the Bossy Gillis Bridge, but also from the river itself if you're on a boat. And we don't want it to dominate. We don't want it to dominate Newburyport. In other words, we want people to think, oh, here's New England Development with Newburyport behind it. It should fit in to Newburyport. In the density, again, that's a tough one because in our code we don't use floor area ratio at all downtown. We only use it on Plum Island. Mm-hmm. So, and what we've relied on is whatever you can fit within the height limit and the lot coverage, you can go ahead and do. On the other hand, I do think we could probably figure out a unit count that we're comfortable with We did that for the 40R district. We went through that, this council went through that exercise a few years ago, and we came up with what we thought was a reasonable maximum. So we could do that here too. Another thing is, how do you equate the difference between a hotel room and a dwelling unit? I would argue it's not that different. Because the kind of dwelling units that they would do, I believe, would be small. They're not really family units. They're much more like a hotel room. So it's fungible to me. You know, if they're going to do, say they do, for example, only 50 hotel rooms instead of 100, they could make that up on the dwelling units on the other end. But the whole point is the net has to be the same, so we can control how many cars. And that gets to the cars. The existing zoning says, if you use this special permit process, you have to park on site. You cannot use city parking garage. And happily, that's consistent with what we did last year too. They have to park on their own. But as I said, shared parking, which is in there, makes sense. They can figure that out. The traffic improvements, that's really the Gillis Bridge. And we have no signals for what's like a 6-legged intersection there. And I would expect they're going to exacerbate that problem, and so therefore they would need to mitigate. But also, when the time comes someday, if we ever go forward with this developer or another, we are going to negotiate for community benefits. And that is what we would do in closed session, because we don't want to tip our hand. Other things we might want to think about is, they own other land in the city, if we go with this developer. And you could make that part of the deal. Lower Custom House Way comes to mind. We have a dispute with them over who owns all of that. Architectural compatibility, to me, actually, that's my number one objection to the existing Waterfront West overlay, is it's way too vague on that, and basically says, go to the planning board, and they'll work it out, and they can even I don't like how loosey-goosey it is also on changes. The fact is, for a little city like Newburyport, a project of this scale, we would really want the city council to know exactly what the design standards are. You'd bake it right in, and then be able to enforce it under the development agreement. And so it's much more like our 40R. You'll remember we had really detailed design standards there. And then I already talked about the public benefits. So again, let's sum up. All I'm saying is, I do think no matter what you want to do with NED, this may be the time to spruce up the Waterfront West zoning. There's all kinds of concern with NED, but I'm not concerned about dealing with them, actually, because we are in the driver's seat completely. They need 8 votes to get this done. And so if we're smart enough to write in these architectural design guidelines, if we're smart enough to know what the views are going to look like so that their buildings don't dominate the skyline, I do think this is a good opportunity to get high-quality development. What I think would be a missed opportunity, not the end of the world, but a missed opportunity is if they were to sell off pieces, we probably could get a hotel. Someone could do a Marriott or a Days Inn or whatever. They could. The fact is the quality is not going to be very good. The design quality just won't be there. And this is a chance, this is the trade-off. If we work with one developer, we can put the screws to them, but they also need the critical mass, whatever that is, to make it financeable. So those are my thoughts. And again, it's really up to the council where to go from here. We're in the driver's seat.
I'm going to try to get someone else involved. Councillor Khan.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, Councilor Eigenman. I actually thought that was a good kind of walkthrough. I do have a couple of more of a procedural questions, and I like this venue where we could go through each of these and give our opinion. Much of where I lie is similar to what Councilor Eigenman had just stated, but more in terms of moving forward, are we going to take each one of these and then talk about modifications where they may make sense based on what we just heard about the overlay district? Or do we refer to a planning and development committee, or are we going to get into those details right here? So I just more have a question of clarification procedurally.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I don't have a clear answer. I think it depends on what you are comfortable with as a body, and I'm kind of reading a lot of furrowed brows and things, and I think we may, with a little bit of discussion tonight and maybe an extended discussion at a future date, get to the point where we can go item by item by item through the Waterfront West summary that the planning director's given us and say, yeah, we agree with this generally. We agree with that, but we have some questions about this one. And if there are questions about it, how would we modify it? Would we make it more restrictive? Would we ease away from the restriction that it imposes? Again, item by item. So I would love us to get to that point tonight. I suspect we won't. So I can't give you a clear answer, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, and then just to add on to that, like, I really do like the units per acre, I think is great. I know the floor area ratio is not, is not something that we have asked New England Development to really be mindful of, but I do think that was a very compelling display when we saw how the rest of the area is down there, and to see 1.35, I don't know if we could put anything like that in terms of guidance, but if the units per acre is the guidance we could give, I would really like to see that actually somehow defined, if that makes sense. In terms of commercial space, we talked about the hotel, but there was also the discussion of having the square footage of commercial space versus the active frontage and the location. And for me, I think that's a really key aspect. What I've heard from other people is this whole concept of competition being over there versus for downtown, the other downtown businesses. But in talking to others, it seems like that may not be as big of a concern. But I do think the active frontage commercial space is a really, actually I really like that better than this open commercial space percentage within the buildings. In terms of the other aspect, the parking requirements, and this has come up quite a bit. I mean, I think the number of units, and I'm wondering if the units per acre, and then also understanding the parking requirements that would really need to be in place, that to me just seems really an important spot here to be mindful of. And I do think the one thing that really resonated with me when we did have that presentation on the 2018 plans was on the boats and how getting the boats over into the docks or out from the docks and collected the smaller, how you have for smaller boats something, then for larger boats, that's currently what's there right now. And this conversation of the boats being moved through these arches and things that were there didn't really have any logic to it. So I think that's part of what I'm hoping as we do define this more, we do think of the traffic aspect of it and the pedestrian connectivity. And I'm not sure, again, how do we make that within the constraints of of the overlay district. But those are some things that really popped out as areas that need to be thought through.
I'm going to ask the planning director to respond because he was at that meeting with the harbor master and all. I'm not sure if your understanding of the way in which the waterfront might be used is consistent with what we heard, because what I heard was a lot of the servicing, the storage, the hauling would take place elsewhere, upriver, at other properties that they own. Whereas the waterfront use, having a marina, an active marina there with a couple of small stores, perhaps to a chandlery and perhaps a livery for someone who's renting boats or something like that, would still take place down on the waterfront, and as would the ticket counter for access to the party boats. But the servicing of hauling big vessels out, snaking its way through this site seems inconsistent with where that discussion went. Do you want to comment? And then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I agree with the president on that. The discussion we had with New England Development and with the harbor master and with one of their marina operators, their key marina operator, essentially they said we're going to be having all the majority of our boat launches happening upriver. We'd move the large lift, the small one would be the only one that would stay there, and I believe it would probably largely serve the ones that are going right to that marina, those set of docks right there. And effectively, you wouldn't have, so in the 2003 plan, I think there was an assumption that you'd have a much larger area along that waterfront area devoted to the marina on the land side. And in this case, New England Development saying, no, really the lift is the piece you're going to have there, the small lift, and it's really going to be the beginning of the season and the end of the season. You may see a few boats coming in and out, but for the most part, that public space will be accessible, other than the cars. Obviously, that's a discussion to have about where the cars park down there, but generally speaking, the pedestrians would have that area there. It would not be a ton of boats going back and forth all the time. You'd have the beginning of the season and the end of the season, and all those other boating activities would happen upriver. And the harbor master seemed completely satisfied with that response. I don't want to speak for him, but he seemed satisfied that that was completely, reasonable. Didn't think it would have have any impact on the marina that's there today or the boating community as a whole for Newburyport's waterfront.
So I do want to just say the small lift will remain. So there's still going to be, I mean, I do want to emphasize that that's not going away. So there's still going to be some consideration, I hope, made in getting those boats on, even the small lift.
Yes, yep.
Other councilors? Councilor Genta?
Where is the large lift now? Where has it been, where is it going to be relocated?
They had told us upriver to one of their marinas further up the river. We didn't specify exactly where it's going to be sited, but we know it would go upriver to one of their marinas, and they would basically launch the larger boats there, and you'd have only the small lift to launch some smaller things here.
Okay.
If I may add something to that, Larry? There's a question about whether or not there is sufficient depth for the larger vessels at the site that they own upriver, which is the old Kathy Ann's lot.
That's where I was going.
Yeah.
And that large lift is really important, because if you don't have it, then folks are going to have to go up to Portsmouth.
Well, ironically, the big party boats don't draw very much water. It's the keel boats, the sailboats with 6 and 7 and 8 foot draft that need the deeper water. But the party boats end up drawing 4.5, maybe 5 feet, which might be accommodated up there. But again, you're asking an important question. Where would it go? If it goes upriver, it's going to be challenging.
Councilor Tonto would like to.
One moment.
I have one more
Go
question.
ahead, Councilor Genta, and then Councilor Tantar.
So Andy, on the flood maps, can you bring the flood maps back up? I know in 2003 they didn't have these flood maps. I think they're more of a creation of about, 2008 or so, when the new flood maps came in. Now, when you look at the sketch plan from 2003, there's a lot fewer buildings, and they're away from the water. And I'm wondering, were they thinking about flooding at that time, or was that, were they preparing for that thought?
There's not a whole lot of mention that in the document itself. I'm sure there was some consideration of that. I don't know whether sea level rise was consideration at that time. I'm sure flooding might have been a consideration. There's not a direct discussion point in the document that I can see in there. There may be some meeting notes that I went back further in detail in there. But for many reasons, I think that my guess is, based on what I've reviewed and having spoken to a few people who were involved at the time, is that probably had mostly to do with the active marina and the public space being down by the water's edge. But it may also have had an indirect tie into the flood zones.
And does the flood zone, I know you don't have it with 2003 sketch plan, but how deep does the flood zone go into New England Development's proposal, regardless 2017, 2018?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually, what New England Development actually did was they showed, so this is their, oh no, actually they don't have their buildings on it, but this is the plan that they had prepared showing the flood zones today, how far they go up. So there's different flood zones, obviously, by color coding, but down by the water's edge, obviously you'd have to raise the buildings a lot further than you would further up the hill where you've already got some grade there, and then you could just add a few feet. But that's how far it goes up into the site. And so obviously, as Councilor Eigenman pointed out, I think we have to consider, there's many different options of dealing with it, but unless you want to have a ton of fill brought in here, which might actually be cost prohibitive for anybody to develop it anyway, you have to assume, I think, that there's going to be parking nestled underneath or back in there.
I understand, okay. And I wasn't sure if, how deep it went in, and that's a shame to see how, it's pretty much the entire site. Yeah.
It is.
Well, I just look at this sketch plan from 2003, and you see a much smaller development. You see more open space around the waterfront, and then you see what New England Development, continues to give us, and it's an awful lot of buildings. It's 25 pounds in a 5-pound bag is what it is. Versus the sketch plan where you have a real open waterfront and then you've got buildings in the back. So I was hoping somehow that would correspond with the floodplains, but that does not seem to be the case.
I believe Councilor Tantar wants to jump in, so I'm going to allow Councilor Tantar to speak or ask his questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if I need to repeat or miss something, you'll understand. I think I heard Council Ivan say that he thought somewhere, paraphrasing, somewhere about 90% of the 2003 strategic plan could be kept and was good. And that's where I'm at. I'd probably be higher than that. I want to be on the record. I really like the 2003 plan. And the two aspects of it that haven't been mentioned, although Councilor Johnson just did mention it. I like the concept of Wall Street in that 2003 plan much better than any of these proposals for the hotel right on the waterfront or another building on the waterfront. In the 2003 strategic plan is sort of a concept of what that Wall Street would be like, and I like it quite a bit, and I think I'd want to hold on to that. The second thing that I think people have referred to are the smaller blocks, the shorter blocks, and I think I like that as well. I think that could also help to break up the mass and the density of the buildings in both the 17 and 18 plans. Now, from my understanding of what's been said, and I missed some of it, the crux of the matter is that because the ground level can't be used, and so except for parking, apparently, then we have to agree to increase the height above 35 to 40 feet, or the project is not financially feasible. That's my thing, and I'll ask you the question, am I correct that basically is where we're at? We're going to have to increase the height or nothing's going to happen. And sort of a corollary to that is, I just can't get past the notion that having parking on the ground floor is not going to be very attractive. And it's actually going to repel people from wanting to go anywhere near the place. And that's just a comment. So, thank you. Hope you can hear some of that.
Could I speak to those two points? Yeah, especially the height question. I didn't hear an assumption that apparently Councilor Tantar heard about going up, but go ahead.
Yeah, so in discussions with NED, I do think that they feel that it would not be feasible, given the constraints here, if we did not give some credit to allow for the flood zones here, essentially that they can put parking there on that first level, like Councilor Eigenman pointed out, but they can't do anything else with that area. So allowing them meaningful floor space for uses that we typically would have in Market Square, for instance, of a 3-story building or a 3 to 4-story building, above that is what they're asking for, and that's NED's justification for the additional height that they're proposing is we have to get above the flood zone with those uses that cannot be, by regulation, on that ground level there in the flood zone. So that, I think, is the main point that they have raised.
I perhaps misinterpreted Councilor Tantar's question. I believe he asked, are we assuming that a 5-story height limit is appropriate? And I don't think we've come anywhere near that kind of agreement.
Well, he didn't say 5. He
Would you
said
like
5. Well, I will point out,
Go ahead.
if you're going to require the developer to do all of the parking on site, and you have a choice, either they're going to park in the open space or they're going to park under the building. So we do need to be realistic about that. There's the laws of physics have to be complied with. If I had to pick, I'd like to keep the rule that they self-park. And so, and also that's another discussion. When they came in last year, they said 6,500 square feet of commercial. Now they've raised it to 10,000. And it's unclear. When I said 90% I agree with 90% of the 2003 master plan, it's unclear from that plan exactly what balance they wanted between
I was going to ask you that question.
retail and personally, and Ward 2's the ward I represent in downtown, I don't want this to be a huge retail area for several reasons. But I'd say chiefly we can't really accommodate the traffic. And that generates, retail is going to need a much higher parking requirement. So I guess one of the things I was looking at is, are they in the ballpark on basically saying we have some ground floor retail, and then most of it is hotel and residential. Speaking only for myself, I'm okay with that, but I guess I'd really like to hear tonight from the other counselors, if they're not, if they're not okay with that, we should go back to NED and tell them, because then it's over.
Perhaps councilors would like, we start to focus a little bit on coming to agreements on certain proposals. This is the first one. Would councilors like to chime in on that question about the proportion of retail to residential space, or the total square footage of retail, however you want to define it? Do they have the balance right, or are we thinking of something with less retail use? Councilor Devlin?
I just, before we go to that,
Go ahead.
I think the last subject that we were talking about is where we were trying to reach some agreement. And I think that's why Charlie chimed in, that's where Larry chimed in, is that, and I wanted to make a comment on that before, right after Councilor Tantar.
All right, can we hold that idea then with Councilor Eigenman?
Right, just let me make this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the problems we're having here, I think, what I'm hearing, is this design is bringing us back to how Newburyport was 50 years ago, where things were built up to the waterfront. But we've torn all those things down since the 70s, and so now our waterfront, if you think about it, is mostly open, running all the way up, with Cashman and further up Toll Building. So this actually is counterintuitive to that, where the 2003 plan had open space running across there, and then less bulky buildings and less massed buildings that fit in better. So I think that's, now we're getting into things that I'm not sure that it does go into what are we going to have on the first floor, how much density we're going to have. But I think we've, and I think the public at the last meeting reached some consensus that the 2003 plan, that's where I think we'd start on an agreement, is having open space in front of these buildings is better. And then the 2003 plan, to Andy's point, was, and Jared's point, was there were more defined blocks, like the orange, sketch. There were more defined and smaller blocks, and I think I just heard that in Charlie too. So I think our first point of agreement, not to speak for everybody, but is that having the space having some buffer between waterfront and building, and then more smaller cut up blocks is probably, and I'm not sure it's feasible, but that's probably more palatable to the majority of people and majority of councilors.
All right. Would people want to respond to that? Council.
Well, I just wanted to make a point that at some point, this process, in my view, should take mind of the parallel process that this development will have to go through with Chapter 91. And it seems to me that what is presented to the city should show where the presumptive Chapter 91 line is on this property, and therefore how that's going to dictate how much development can occur and where it can occur on their property. So it's two different types of land use regulations coming together, and in that process, the city is required to certify that the project as proposed to the Chapter 91 folks is compliant with zoning. And so really those two processes have to speak to each other. So at some point, I'm presuming that NED will come forward with a plan that shows how what they're proposing to the city would also be Chapter 91 compliant.
Could I ask you to follow up on that with a 30-second blurb on what Chapter 91 is for the broader audience?
Sure. Chapter 91 is state legislation, and it goes back to olden times where the waterfront was really for the benefit of the public. And so it treats waterfront properties as generally for the benefit of the public, and regulates land use and fill and other activities on the waterfront. And there's clearly going to be some Chapter 91 jurisdiction. It may not be the entirety of the site, and it may be this weird jagged line, but there is a presumptive Chapter 91 line, which they can rely on. It's downloadable from the Department of Environmental Protection's website. And so that would, and in my opinion, should inform the city's review of this, so that we don't have a project that's non-91 compliant, and you go back to the drawing boards. That doesn't work for them, that doesn't work for the city.
Thank you.
Just one follow-up.
Councilor Devlin, follow.
So I actually think that was my problem with this plan, is that, and it's a big conflict in Boston, with the hotel and the archway, it's actually making people feel like that middle space is not public space, and that's the space that they're saying the public can enjoy. So you have this around the north end, you have a big bulky building like 3F and 4F, and they put a little pedestrian walkway around it, or down in the Seaport where the Contemporary Art Museum is,
Yeah.
they have a walkway there, and everybody proposes, oh, I'm going to put a cafe out there. No, that walkway needs to remain, open. Around the Battery Wharf in the North End is a big one. They have a harbor walk around it where, when they have gatherings, people don't think they can walk around, but that was there for the Chapter 91 requirements. So that's one of my issues with this, is it starts segmenting off this, what should be public spaces, making the public that's sitting in what hopefully is an expanded park not thinking they can actually go through there easily.
I see. Thank you. Councilor Zede, did I shut you off?
Yeah, no, I want to just make a few comments, so thank you. First of all, I want to answer the first question of the night, which is why are we here? I think it's a really good question, really good. I think the answer to me is because this land is going to be developed. It will be developed, and it's not that one hasn't crossed in a crazy thought that somehow we'd buy the land and keep it from being developed, but that'd be a big check to write for all of us. So I think that's where I start. My thinking is that this land is going to be developed, so we can't just walk away and sort of just leave it alone and say we're done. The second point I wanted to make is I've been hoping to have this meeting for a while, because when I started reading the overlay district more closely, I started to get really nervous, because there are several elements in it that lead me to believe that it's not the shield that people think it may be. And so I understand having the reaction when you see a plan you don't like to just say, just leave the overlay district as it is. And it may very well be better than some of the things we've seen, but that doesn't make it inherently good itself. It has its flaws. I think we've kind of poked at some of the intents maybe they had, some of the weaknesses in terms of taking the 03 master plan and then taking it from being a master plan, which is sort of like an 80,000 foot document, and then making it into actual zoning. So that's the basis for my questions. That's why I'm trying to understand where the holes are in overlay district and where it may be weak. And and then the third comment I want to make is, look, if people do understand what the overlay district is, and that's one reason I wanted us to go through it, is if people understand it and they like it, then I'm fine with it too. I don't have but I want everybody to know what it is, because I don't want to be harangued in the streets if something gets built under overlay district and it's not what people expected at all and they're not happy. And I certainly would be one of those folks if somebody came in and proposed 20 buildings on a 5,000 square foot lots each, which looked truly bizarre. Okay, so those are my first three comments. The next one is the priorities for the project. The reason I'm so thrilled to have this discussion is because we're finally coming back to what our zoning is and what our master plan is, rather than letting the developer kind of take us around. And the reason I don't like that is that it becomes, the word negotiation has been used several times. I think everybody's remarked that in different meetings. We're having negotiation. The problem with the negotiation is it starts to make you feel like you have to give things up in order to get something, and now what you're doing is you're selling your zoning, which is actually permissible from what I understand in Massachusetts, but doesn't make it a good idea. And so the number one, so in terms of priorities, is I think we should stop thinking about this as a negotiation. And there's a lot of parallels to me with the Brown School, which some of you may or may not be following in our right on the line of my ward and the Ward 2 councilors, which is that we want everything. We want it to be everything. We want to have, so here in this context, we want a hotel, we want public space, we want a marina, we also want to have beautiful parks in it, and we want to have all these different things. And so as we ramp up our expectations, they ramp up what they want, and so we're chasing each other basically. So they go from 145 units to 230, and then they give us a few things and say, here are the things that you wanted. I think this is I think it's driving us to make it's moving us in the wrong direction. So with all due respect, and I have a kind of a place I'm going with this, I don't think we should look at it that way anymore. I think the way Councilor Eigenman framed it is exactly what I wanted to say. Let's just figure out what we don't like about what we have now and fix it, and then whoever wants to come and build under that zoning is more than welcome to come and do that. We do want to welcome development. I do think that this is an opportunity for the city, given that it's going to be developed and it's going to be developed by somebody. So my top priority, which we haven't talked about at length, is that I want to get something that basically, first and foremost, doesn't destroy our public infrastructure. We haven't really talked a lot about that. I'm the chair of public utilities, and I give me serious heartburn to think about the sewer line that runs from the Route 1 bridge to the plant. So it's not about 140 units or 150 units. It's that they're all in one place. So, and that was never contemplated in overlay district, because when you write these beautiful master plans, you never have to think about sewer lines and all the other things that make the city go. So that's just one. Parking is another public resource, sewer, water, school system, which is all oft of great debate in these things. So that's the first thing I think we need to clear up is what do we think our public infrastructure can handle in that specific spot, not in the whole city. We can always absorb 130 units, I think, if they were spread out all across the city, but when you put them all in one place. The second thing, if we can clear that hurdle, is getting something that's appropriate in scale and design for Newburyport, and then everything else is after. So for me, like, the public benefits package, the boardwalk, retail space, hotels. To me, that's all lower on the list. I would not personally give up huge concessions on density to get a hotel. I realize I may be in the minority on that. I know a lot of people have been talking about a hotel for a long time, but at what cost? I mean, if we have to go up to these huge numbers, then what are we doing there? We shouldn't really sell what I think is sort of the soul of the city in order to make it happen. So I guess what I'm saying is my Ward 5 councilor, my good friend, who had a good point, it's 25 pounds in a 5-pound bag. We can't do the same thing. So our expectations can't be that we're going to get 25 pounds of benefit into a 5-pound bag. So my last comment is to your question and what you're I don't think it's reasonable for us to sit here and say we're going to agree on how many square feet of retail. I felt for a long time that the right way to do this is through a city council ad hoc committee with 5 people on it, gets you closer to the 8 you need. And the way we agree, and one of the biggest things I think we failed on and why the process hasn't worked is, I'm not sure what the developer's hearing. It seems to me that they're hearing mixed messages from different parties or different groups, and then there's some unification on the message. The way we agree on things is we take a vote. So I think 5 councilors should go and sit in a room for the next 3 months, come up with a proposal, bring it back to us, and we take a vote. If we agree, then that's what we send to the developer and say, here you go, this is what we can live with, whether it's 6,000 square foot of retail or 10,000. But if we just kind of make a scratch list here and then we send it to them and then they comply with it, or they think they're complying with it, they come back here and then everybody changes their mind because the public needs to have their input, it's a waste of everybody's time. So that's my suggestion. I know I've pitched this to you several times because I felt strongly that this is the way to do it. It's also intensely public, whereas we've had a lot of private discussion, I think, or at least there have been private meetings. Not saying that with a negative connotation, because this is a tough thing to work out. But we did it. They meet in this room. It's public. Anybody can come if they want to get into the nitty-gritty details. And that's how I think we should do it. And if you really want to have the debate about specific topics, I'll have them about retail or whatever you want. I have views on all of them, but I just don't think it's going to be productive to go back to giving them some back of the napkin stuff. We need to get 8 votes on something, and that's how we tell them this is what we can live with or we can't. So those are my 5 cents, 2 cents. I don't know.
I'm going to recognize Councilor Eigenman, but first I'm going to ask Council to, in case there's any disagreement, because I think part of what you said we can address very quickly and easily, and that is mitigation measures, public infrastructure, that sort of thing. Would you care to address that, Rebecca? Our expectation, as a matter of fact, their expectation as well, is that public infrastructure is public, and they have to meet whatever requirements there are for water, sewer, and utilities that we wouldn't otherwise be providing. That's on their plate. And if that means changing some force mains to go all the way down from the sewer plant to the site, so be it. It's on their dime, not on ours. If that means Mass Electric, it was a National Grid, gives us electricity. Mass Electric, excuse me. I can't keep them straight. If it means National Grid or Mass Electric providing utilities to the site have to change some of the infrastructure that the rest of the city depends on, so be it. That's on their dime. So I'd like to get those mitigation elements out of the way. Those are not things that we have to provide, nor should they be taxed unreasonably by this development. The next step are community benefits, which are kind of a separate category. Have I expressed that clearly?
Yeah,
Rebecca?
I guess what I would say is that I would expect that any approval from the city would include a comprehensive look at the impact of the development by the various city agencies. So for example, the Department of Public Works, having determined that there is no existing sewer capacity that could be, could accommodate this development, would say, these are the following things that have to happen, and I would assume that those obligations would be baked into whatever special permit, for example, were granted for the project. What I think the difference is that there also has to be some consideration about when that would be delivered and how to ensure that that is in fact delivered. So for example, by the issuance of a certificate of occupancy for the first building or something like that. And I think that some of the operational issues can get addressed in a development agreement, in a contract with the developer. So say the developer agrees to do a redo of the entire intersection, how that gets designed, how that gets implemented, the logistics of all that may be in the development agreement, where their obligation and what that obligation really means would be baked into the zoning relief. So in either way, they would be obligations running with the land, whether we're doing the development that ultimately developed it or another developer. But I quite agree with the council president that there is mitigation, and all the mitigation is really to be owned by a developer.
Quick follow on, Councilor. Well, I'd like to move to Councilor Ogden. He's had his hand up for a while. Councilor?
Was that another meeting? Do you mind if I take?
No, go ahead. I understand you're working under certain constraints. Councilor Ogden?
Yeah, no, I'm all for, if people aren't ready to discuss tonight, that's perfectly reasonable. But I guess what I'm trying to get out of the meeting is, there are a few of us who, especially on the planning development committee, we put a lot of time into this over a couple of years. And I guess what I want to know is that it's even worth the effort. I mean, that's really, so I wasn't expecting people to say, we agree to, 7,000 square feet of retail, but if they're not even in the ballpark, if people are saying, look, they need to comply with the existing zoning and that's it, I guess I would want to know that now. That's where I was getting to. I don't think that's what I'm hearing. I think I'm hearing, people recognizing conditions have changed in the last 15 years, so there's more work for us to do. But a couple things, that people should think about. This is not, the business world where you have two parties with equal power negotiating. It's completely asymmetrical. I mean, the public is driving the bus here. It may not seem that way to some, but the developer knows really the only thing they're going to be able to negotiate are these community benefits. The mitigation, like we just said, I realize in Newburyport we're not always great at it, but in other communities the mitigation happens automatically. It's not a negotiation. All right, I'll be less pussyfooting around. We're terrible at it here, but everywhere else the developer pays the mitigation. It's not even a discussion. I guess on the Chapter 91, we do have to tread carefully there because it's pretty complex. A hotel actually is considered to be a facility of public accommodation. So that's actually one of the uses that the state really likes on the waterfront. And they don't have any real problem with it. It's private residences on the ground floor that they have a problem with. Mm-hmm. But I guess the fundamental question I want to get at is, if you go back to the comparison, Andy, of the 2003 strategic plan and the 2018, go to the 18 one. I mean, what I'm hearing from Councilor Devlin, Councilor at Large, is that sort of yellow area on the left is where his head is, And what they're proposing on the right is different. Basically, they're trying to get development value out of waterfront. And again, I don't even know if there's a waterfront development use zone here, probably not. You know, I haven't looked at the regs, we'll get there. But that's kind of a fundamental question. So if most councilors are saying, listen, I don't want anything north of that line, that's a big deal. I don't personally agree with it, because also another thing that changed since 2003 is we now know there will be no development on the central waterfront. None. All of those gyrations for 40, 50 years about what would happen is over. Staked through the heart of the vampire. There are going to be no buildings on the central waterfront. This is it. So I would rather, again, I'm showing my hand, but I would rather, as a community benefit, get some donation from the developer toward the park we're trying to build in the central waterfront than duplicate the central waterfront here. That doesn't seem like very good policy to me. But that's it. I guess I'm more interested in how we wrap up tonight. If this is just DOA, you know, no room, that's cool. You know, let's tell them that. But I don't think it is, you know, and then let's figure out a way to keep working.
And it is 8:59 by my watch. We've been at it for a while. Let's keep in mind that people have lives, and you have lives, and we probably have a lot more to chew on than we expected based on this conversation. So this is obviously not the last discussion that's going to take place. Councillor Devlin, and then I'd like someone to help summarize this so we can move toward a close. Councillor.
And look, there is room to maneuver on as long as we get a benefit out of it, and that's Councilor Eigenman and I have talked about that before, is we have a big, if you look on that 2000, the one with the orange on it, they had green written on the side, and it said planned park extension or something to that effect. And that's certainly something, over to the right, would it say future park? Mm-hmm. That's certainly something that's a benefit that I would be willing to, or certainly talk to constituents about exchanging, is money. We've talked about fixing interchanges. Well, we're building a garage to take the stated number one purpose is to take parking off of that spot right there. Mm-hmm. So if New England Development wanted to, you know, erect the carp or fishman memorial park there, I would be that's an exchange that we certainly should consider, because we've often talked about in our debate about the garage is removing those parking spaces. Well, we can't do that until we actually have the money to remove it, and when we're going to have a couple extra $1 million around. So that's certainly a public benefit that in any sort of development agreement we could ask for if we're going to give up, you know, something substantial. So,
thank you. Other comments from the councilors? Then let me ask if someone has a suggestion for a next step. We could close the discussion now. We're going to go home, have discussions with one another, have discussions with other folks in the community. Here, I'm certain, from the public here assembled and from those who aren't here tonight but maybe listening in at home.
What about Councillor Zeid's suggestion? He's the one who put forward a suggestion.
Yep. Councillor Zeid, do you want to?
We could do it as committee.
Well, I mean, I think,
by the way,
yeah.
May I express an opinion on it? I thought that's why we had a committee on planning and development, but go ahead.
Well, I think I hear what you're saying, but I think with zoning, if you're going to have some folks spend a lot of time, there's a huge benefit to adding 2 more people, which keeps you under the 6 quorum. And if you need to get to 8, coming to the table, as we did with the ad hoc, with 5 councilors having spent in-depth time with it and coming to some kind of compromise is a lot better than 3 people toiling in the night to come here just so that, you know, basically 4 councilors can kill it. I mean, that's the blunt, honest assessment of how I think this works. That's number 1. And number 2 is, you know, I think the Planning and Development Committee deserves help. I mean, they just got beat up pretty good on cannabis for 9 months. And now we're going to send them away and say, go solve Waterfront West for us and then come back in a few months. I mean, give them 2 more people. And again, I can't overstate the public benefit of having them be public meetings. They're posted on the website. Anybody can come to them. I mean, That's how I look at it. There's some committees that are exceptionally heavy, and I think this is easily a once-in-a-generation problem. Give 2 more people is all I'm basically saying. It's the only difference between having a planning development committee. And I think they could be stated with a very express purpose and timeline, which is to come back to us with a draft set of changes to Waterfront West Overlay District. I think that's the benefit we came up with tonight's meeting. And I think it could be time limited. I think the ad hoc for the waterfront was similar, and I would propose that, we try and look at this by the end of the year, is basically, which isn't that much time, by the way, but we also have a zoning rewrite potentially coming to crush all of us in January. So we have work, we should span our work out so we can give everything due attention. I mean, I wouldn't hold anybody to the timeline, but that's how I think about it.
I really wish I could agree with you that this is a once-in-a-lifetime crushing event, because it turns, every time I turn around, it seems like there's something else coming at us. What do members think about that proposal? Councillor Khan.
I thank the councillor from Ward 1. I think that's a great idea. I'm all in favor of ad hoc and giving more people to assist a committee. And what I would like to know is what the chair of the Committee of Planning and Development thinks of that. I know you mentioned Committee of the Whole, which is another way. So I would love to hear from the Planning and Development Committee what they think of that idea.
Councillor Eigenman?
Well, how about this? I mean, we could do it as a 5-member committee. That did work well. And then we could advertise it as Committee of the Whole so everybody could speak. You want to do it that way? But we have 5 voting members. I'm just worried that we won't get, turnout. People won't make it all. But the 5 would have to show up to every meeting. How's that?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Other opinions?
I like it.
I agree.
I like
I agree.
that.
It is we can take a vote on this if you'd like, or I can assume the prerogative of the chair and assign
it's
5
your
people.
prerogative.
It is your prerogative.
But let me do something dangerous and ask people who would be interested in serving on a 5-member committee to raise their hands so we can whittle this down a little. Councillors, Andy, take notes quick.
Yeah.
Councillor Shan, Councillor Eigenman, Councillor Khan, Councillor Devlin, Councillor Junta, Councillor Zeid.
So there you go. You got it.
Planning and development is already in
Planning and
there.
development's already.
So,
You just have to pick from 3 out of
yeah.
2 out of 3.
2 out of 3. And they're all invited anyway.
But they're not voting.
But they're not voting. You have to pick who gets to vote.
I don't think you
That's
have
why
to
you
do
get
it
the big
now.
votes, Barry.
It's
I'll
it's
tell you
your
what,
prerogative.
let me think about it. We have a meeting a week from tonight. I agree that this is something we should do. I'll talk to a couple of the members and see what your time availability is. I know that with the enthusiasm of the moment, you may have raised your hand and said, really, I'm not sure. And on Monday, I will announce the 5 members of the committee.
Okay.
Is that fair?
More than fair.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to conclude with, Andy? I'm not inviting you to speak, unless you really are dying to get something in.
No, I think I appreciate it. Giving me the offer. I really appreciate the council's time with this. I really do think that spending some extra time on this is worthwhile. I know Councilor Argument has pointed this out. I really do think it's beneficial for us to work with something that is cohesive as a site and as a project than to say, let's scrap it and go back to the drawing board over again. Yeah. This happens quite a bit here, and I think that progress can be made here to work out the issues that are involved. So thank you.
Rebecca, is there anything you want to whisper in our ears right now?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Councilor Ackerman, are you raising your hand, or are you just listening? Okay, I apologize. We'll be together a week from now. I want to thank the people who came and listened and so patiently to us take 2 hours out of your busy lives tonight. And I know that you'll be on the telephones, at the bars, at the coffee shops, at wherever you find us, in the street, on the aisles at the market basket, letting us know how you feel about what transpired tonight and what ideas you have to contribute to the process. So thank you for coming out. Saying that, I'll accept the motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. We're done.
That's actually what I thought was going to happen in the first 15 minutes of the night. I literally thought it was going to be, I thought it was going to be a half-hour meeting. Did we all agree on this? Yes, okay, let me choose it.